Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the AALU August Advocacy webinar brought to you by MetLife. I'm Michael Gleason, the Director of Legislative Affairs here at AALU, and this month we are joined by AALU Counsel Jeff Ricchetti and Ken Kies. This month's topic will be a recap of the two conventions and a look ahead towards November. Today we have two experts who are going to give us their perspective on the conventions that they attended and what we see towards the November. So to kick it off, let's start with Ken Kies and his perspective on the Republican National Convention.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Well, to kind of get us warmed up, I want to share a couple of my favorites from the late night talk shows leading up to the convention about from the two candidates. So just a couple, just to kind of have a little humor to begin. Jimmy Fallon said it's been reported that Trump's list of running mates is now down to just two people, and they are Chris Christie. He also said that Trump was picking, that the New York Times said he had picked Pence because Pence is someone who's unlikely to embarrass Trump, which raises the question, is there anything that can embarrass Trump? And then third, also Jimmy Fallon, he said, I saw that Hillary Clinton spoke to her donors at a special performance of Hamilton this week and said she has seen the show 3 times. Then she got back to saying how she can relate to everyday working class Americans. And then finally, Stephen Colbert reporting that Trump had narrowed the choice of the vice president down to 3, Chris Christie, Mike Pence, and Speaker Gingrich, a diverse group if you go by polling ability. So anyway, just to get us started here. In terms of the Republican convention, you know, it was like a lot of other conventions, and I've been to every one since 1980, except for the convention in San Diego in '96. You had a bunch of funny people walking around wearing strange clothes and doing the usual rah-rah stuff that political parties do. But if I was going to list maybe sort of 8 interesting takeaways, here's what they would be. On Sunday of the convention, the police union chief issued an open letter to John Kasich suggesting that Kasich declare a state of emergency and ban the open carry rule in Ohio, which allows you to carry weapons in open. Kasich rejected that and pointed out he didn't know what the emergency was. Just in case anybody's interested, in the entire time that I was there through Wednesday night, I didn't see a single person carrying an open carry weapon. So for what it's worth, that was as much attention as it got in the press. It was kind of a non-issue. Number 2 on my list is just a quick snippet of the convention rules, what was prohibited from being brought inside the convention center. And I won't go through all of them, but it does make you what kind of people they thought were going to come to this thing. The items included a blackjack, sword, saber, hatchet, axe, slingshot, BB gun, pellet gun, wrist shot, blackjack, metal knuckles, iron buckle, axe handle, shovel, any firearms, explosives, fireworks, drones or other unmanned aircraft, containers of bodily fluid, ladders, interestingly enough. And the final item on the list, I swear I'm not making this up, is tennis balls. So all those things were prohibited inside the convention center. Indeed, I didn't see any of them myself. Third takeaway is, notwithstanding all the apocalyptic predictions of chaos and mayhem and violence and every other thing you can think of, the whole thing was amazingly peaceful. I barely saw anything that would arise to a demonstration, except one time one of the demonstrators actually lit a flag on fire and then managed to light himself on fire, which prompted the police to say, and I quote, "Hey, stupid, you've lit yourself on fire." But other than that, it was honestly about as peaceful as they get. My 5th takeaway is there were more police and law enforcement than I've seen at any event ever other than Obama's 2 inaugurals. So they came prepared, and notwithstanding a number of predictions they weren't prepared, I would have to say it was they were amazingly well prepared. The traffic flow was very smooth. There were hardly any traffic jams. It was probably as well organized at convention, I guess, as I've seen, and I draw the contrast to Tampa, which was 4 years ago, which was plain horrible. My sixth takeaway is the week before the big convention, the Republicans did approve their platform. It says things that are very different from what Trump is saying on things including trade. And I guess the bottom line on this is who cares, because almost nobody reads the platform. And even if they do, nobody pays any attention to it once the convention is over. So it's there, but it really doesn't much matter. The seventh takeaway is who are the winners coming out of the convention? Cleveland was the big winner. They pulled it off flawlessly. The weather was great. The people in Cleveland were incredibly polite and nice to everyone. And I'd say the other winners were the Trump kids, who really came across as polished and amazingly poised in their speeches. But of course, the big loser, no doubt about it, was Ted Cruz. As Krauthammer put it, he committed political suicide. As Cruz's wife was leaving the convention hall, they were yelling at her, Goldman Sachs, Goldman Sachs, Goldman Sachs, which prompted one of the late night talk shows people to say they better stop doing that or she may turn into Hillary. So anyway, that's it. Big loser, Ted Cruz. I don't know what his political future is, but he sure didn't help it with that presentation. So Mike, let me turn it back to you.
Sure. And for everybody listening on the webinar, if you'd like to join us and have a question, please use the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. Jeff, why don't you give us your take from the Democratic perspective on the Republican National Convention?
Sure, I'll give you the Democratic angle on it, and I generally share the view that Ken gave with respect to both the kind of the process of the convention and the rest, and who were the winners and losers. From a Democratic perspective, I thought what was noteworthy was who wasn't at the convention. They had no one from the Bush dynasty, no Senior, no W, no Jeb. They didn't have either of their last two nominees in McCain or Romney, and several of the primary challengers, who were the more pronounced of them, were not there, particularly host governor Kasich was not in attendance. So it was surprising at kind of the composition going into the convention. There was, an effort of trying to unify the party, as Ken alluded to with Cruz's remarks on Wednesday. I think you'd argue it was largely unanswered. I think the selection of Pence provided some inclusiveness and some harmony there toward the end of the convention. It was clearly a Trump family affair, as Ken alluded to as well, with a family member, either his wife or one of his three children speaking, or three of the children speaking in each of the nights, and then him in the final night. It felt to me like it was, more a branding of Trump than it was a branding of the Republican Party, and if anything, there's clearly kind of a rebranding of the Republican Party that's going on. And if you look at the lineup, particularly in contrast with the lineup that the Democrats followed with the next week, my impression is it was, somewhat uninspiring from the standpoint of names that people would recognize both nationally and internationally. While it was peaceful surrounding the event, there was a fair amount of controversy. And again, not stuff that is necessarily that rises to that high level of importance, but I think, unfortunately for them, the allegations of plagiarism following Marlena's presentation on Monday carried over into Tuesday and had just a kind of left a negative impression generally. And clearly the Wednesday Cruz non-endorsement, again, had a kind of carryover effect in the media that bled into the next day, which was the setup day for Donald Trump. And while I think Pence did an admirable job in his opportunity, in some respects, Cruz's controversy there bled into the show writ large. And then with respect to the final day, and what surprised me about it more than anything, and I thought Ivanka did a very good job, and Donald was Donald, and there weren't any surprises there. But it was, I thought, surprising in that there was a pretty concerted effort to shift to the middle with respect to the substance. Several historic Democratic priorities were mentioned by either Ivanka or Donald, such as, wage women's wage issues. They made reference to the gay lesbian community and trying to be more receptive or supportive to it. Their policies, whether it be with trade or some other matters, are ones that a significant portion of the Democratic caucus supports. He spoke about additional infrastructure spending, again, something that's been a Democratic priority for a while. And Ivanka was more specific in this and basically alluding at one point in her speech to the fact that as a family, they really didn't care terribly much about a party identification. And so it was, I thought her speech in conjunction with Donald Trump's was, a little bit of something for everyone, an effort at inclusiveness, clearly a pivot to the middle. A little surprised with that. That doesn't seem to normally happen until a little later in the campaign. If you look back at the Romney campaign, his pivot really didn't come until the debates more than anything else. Normally you try to, lock down your base through the conventions, and I was surprised with the shift that occurred on the closing night of the convention. It signaled to me what I think is kind of the circumstance that Republicans are in, which is it's a party that's changing in direction, and it's fundamentally changing in composition. And in spite of that transition that they're going through and the upheaval that I think will surround that, they did generate a bump. And so it's hard to argue that it wasn't in some measure a success. But again, it was a kind of a muddled message there for the week, I thought.
Thanks, Jeff. So let's turn now to the Democratic convention and get your take on the Democratic convention.
Yeah, I think, this was a pretty dramatic contrast in my view, just with respect to how it proceeded. The Democratic convention was clearly an effort at trying to get the party to come together and unify. And, they had their set of controversy as well, particularly with respect to the release of emails allegedly by Russia concerning communications within the DNC that favored Clinton over Sanders. But it was hard to see that bleeding into the convention writ large, because we had a fairly strong endorsement later that afternoon and evening as the DNC head resigned, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who frankly I don't think many in the country even know. But with Sanders stepping on the stage and giving a fairly robust endorsement of Clinton and a strong sentiment of the need to defeat Donald Trump, it felt like the controversy that they had was somewhat contained to that day. And that same day, Michelle Obama gave what I think most people considered to be a fairly moving speech herself. And so that seemed to set the tone for the subsequent day. If anything, the Tuesday was somewhat less inspiring in that it was more Bill Clinton trying to humanize Hillary. I think some people might have found it a little too sentimental and romantic considering their life history. But I think he was successful in some measure in putting a human face on Hillary and responding to some of the more malicious characterizations of her that she's acquired over the decades. And then Wednesday was, kind of the greatest hits of the Democratic Party. Biden probably gave one of his better, more succinct speeches with a very stern rebuke of the case that Trump is making to white working class men, particularly. Obama, in his classic means, gave, I think, an inspirational, uplifting, a seminal speech for him. I felt sorry for Tim Kaine, kind of sandwiched between the two of them. But you look at who you had in the day, which was, presidents for the 16 of the last 24 years speaking in the 2 days, very strong message of coming together and the rest. And Clinton, I think, stayed within herself. I think most people would judge it to be a capable speech, a competent speech. I think that was the message that they wanted. They wanted one of unification, one of competence, and a sense of optimism. And I think by and large, it was a well-executed convention in that respect. Had no surrounding controversy outside of the convention in terms of riots or protests or anything. So fortunately for both conventions, they were uneventful. And I think we're just beginning to see whether, in fact, there was a responding bounce. I think, if anything, during the Democratic convention, if there was a downdraft, it was, reports midweek of the convention that Trump was overtaking Clinton in the polling, and then, in fact, he was getting the bounce that most people get from a convention. And I think we're seeing the rebound bounce, and I think it will generate a small but solid lead for her.
And what are your perspectives?
Well, okay, so I have like maybe 8 takeaways from the Democratic convention. Let's start with the firing at Debbie Wasserman Schultz. This culminated from a lot of dissatisfaction within the Democratic Party about how she was running the DNC for really the past year. And one of the more telling stories was that she was given 4 assignments to go meet with Biden about of things that the DNC really needed done. She dropped 2 of them and substituted asking Biden to do a fundraiser for herself, and then the other one was to come to her daughter or son's bar mitzvah. So there were a lot of people that weren't sorry to see her go. Her performances on television were pretty horrible as well. So that's number one. And even though Jeff said the Democrats got off to a good convention, firing the head of your party at the beginning isn't exactly getting things off to a rolling start. But in any of them, number 2, at their convention, one of their demonstrators also lit himself on fire. So we got that covered in both conventions. Same deal, burning a flag, although in this case, I think it was an Israeli flag. Number 3, notably during Hillary's speech, Bill fell asleep, which either that or he was reading the speech on the inside of his eyelids. But that wasn't exactly a great pictorial. And I have to say, Jeff did the best job he could of characterizing Bill's speech about Hillary as sentimental. I think most people found it nauseating. Then we get to the whole issue of unity. And truthfully, I think, to be honest, Democrats have to admit that their party has been dragged really far to the left by Bernie, and that the unity is not 100% there. And the best evidence of it was during Hillary's speech. If you were watching on television, you couldn't tell this very well, but inside the convention hall, because I've talked to people that were there were periodic outbursts of people yelling USA, which seemed rather strange because it was in the middle of Hillary speaking. Well, the reason was because the Bernie people were yelling Bernie, and that was them, the USA people, drowning out the Bernie people. That is, those who had not left the hall at that point. So I think, to be honest, there's still a lot of residual bad feelings, particularly given what came out in those emails that were released by whoever released them, the Russians, the Chinese, you name it. Takeaway number 5 is, and their platform is pretty far left, but I'll say the same thing I did about the Republican platform, which is who cares, because nobody reads it. And it's far left because that was an attempt to placate Bernie. But again, truthfully, nobody really pays much attention to these things. And McAuliffe, in a burst of honesty, which is uncharacteristic for him, noted that Hillary would almost certainly reverse course on the trade agreement. They had to walk that back rather aggressively, but I suspect McAuliffe was probably being accurate and honest. Clearly, number 6, the winner of the convention was Michelle Obama. Clearly, her speech was the home run. Biden gets an honorable mention for bringing the word malarkey back into the political lexicon as only he could. Hillary's speech was okay, not great. And then finally, who was one of the winners? The American flag got back onto the convention stage the second night. After the first night, not a single American flag appeared anywhere. And then by the end of the convention, there were so many American flags you couldn't see. Bottom line on both conventions is not much changed. Pretty much what everybody thought was going to happen, happened. Trump got confirmed or nominated. All of the anti-Trumpers who still were talking about changing the rules and deposing him and all of that was a pipe dream probably from a month and a half to 2 months ago. And in the case of Hillary's convention, pretty much what everybody expected. Although I think the only thing I would suggest Jeff made was a little, not cued on, but perhaps overlooked, was there were actually a number of Democrats that didn't show up at their convention either, principally people who are in tough races, which was the people that didn't show up at the Republican convention as well. Although in the case of, he's right about the Republican convention, some of the people that didn't show up were the sore losers. And I have to say that those people, including John Kasich, as much as I love him, all insisted that Trump sign the pledge last fall that he would support whoever was the Republican nominee. And it's rather, again, nauseating to me to see all those people that insisted that he sign it now reneging on it, including the Bushes. So it's kind of like, if you want to make the rules, you got to live by the rules. Clearly, some of those people didn't think they had to. So let me turn it back to you.
Sure. So now let's pivot to the last part of our discussion, and we have about 100 days left into the election. Ken and Jeff have been, doing in politics and for a long time, and it's really going to be interesting to get their final perspective on where we're going. So why don't I allow you two each to have a few minutes to sort of provide your perspective on the last the last stretch of this campaign. Ken, why don't you go first?
Well, where are we going? We're going to hell. I mean, this is going to be the worst, ugliest, nastiest campaign that any of us have probably ever seen. Both sides don't like their candidate much. The negatives on both of them are so high, it's almost incomprehensible that the two parties nominated them. So we've never seen anything quite like this. And anybody who's brave enough to think they can predict the outcome of this really ought to think twice, at least as relates to Trump. Because if you go back to a year ago, all the smart people in Washington and on the media and on TV all were saying the same thing. This guy's not on the level. He's going to blow up. They got to September. He said something incredibly stupid. They said he's finished now. His poll numbers went up. A week later, something even dumber. They said that's it. He's not even going to go to New Hampshire and Iowa. And the guy got the most votes of any Republican in the presidential primary in history. So if anybody thinks they actually know where this is headed, they're a lot smarter than I am. So I'll turn it to Jeff because he probably is.
I won't pretend to be smarter than Ken ever. But if
are we recording this? Is this being recorded? Yeah. Okay, good.
But I will. I'll say, and I agree with him with respect to the challenges that Democrats still face here. They clearly, in spite of what I think was the best showing that they could put on this, and what I found most notable about the convention was, Bernie Sanders gave his endorsement on Monday. And while you had some agitators within the audience of 25 or so thousand people in the auditorium there, Bernie Sanders was at the entire thing. He was ever present, and the cameras were turning to him, literally within each hour of the presentation. And the speech writers were inclusive of him. Bernie, interestingly, at a Harry Reid going away event on the closing day on Thursday, was like the principal speaker to the senators, of which there were about 25 in attendance, in honor of former leader Reid. So there was a concerted effort, and I believe Bernie was a participant in it, in drawing the party back together. And he couldn't have been more visible. He couldn't have been more cooperative, I don't think, in his doing so. Whether that translates to his supporters is a whole other matter. And I think they have a lot of work still to do in that respect, in spite of what is, you'll read a lot of conflicting information or press reports about whether 75% of Sanders supporters have already converted to Clinton or whether 90% have. And I don't frankly know what to believe because of the static around this, that you get dramatically inconsistent reports of polling about the transfer of support. And I think it's fundamental to whether she'll win. Because as Ken has said, I think there's going to be a very tight race. And I think anyone who thinks they haven't known just has not watched politics long enough, because there's just too much. There's 100 days or more. There's just too many intervening game-changing events that are yet to occur. But in the other reality of it, and the reason I think it will remain close for these two candidates is they both have very hard ceilings. And I think, the disdain for Clinton among Republicans has been developed over 2 decades or more. And I think it will be very hard to dislodge some of those voters. I don't know that she's even, pursuing them. I think, frankly, she's vying for the 5 to 7% of the audience that still has an open mind on who it is they'll nominate. you can count on the unexpected. And as we've seen, even post-Republican convention, Trump will continue to invite and incite controversy. That just is the nature of the beast here. Whether it's inviting, foreign governments to, hack the opponent's email systems, or whether it's attacking the parents of fallen soldiers who admittedly attacked him directly on the podium and followed suit thereafter. But the whole, the fight surrounding that, the controversy surrounding this, I agree with Ken. The rhetoric has never been more vitriolic. The gloves have been off. They're off by everyone, every commentator, every day. So it's as noisy a campaign as you're going to, I think, see, in spite of, the broader civility of it. There weren't the protests or riots or things that people were predicting. And yet it's as verbally hostile as it could be, and I think we're going to see more of it. But as is always the case, there will be some disruptive external event. 9/11 happened on September 11th. Oil spills occur, tsunamis hit, terrorist attacks occur, economies take a dive. There will be something that interrupts this. In terms of the sequence of events and the rest, I think currently what we're going to see come out over the course of the week is Clinton cementing a small, solid lead from the post-convention bump, which I would expect will recede in some measure because the shine will be taken off of it with the what we're going to see now of the campaign in the media in criticism of one another, and I think it's going to be very negative in its context here. But I think she'll garner and hang on to a small and solid lead. I think we're going to see a little bit of a break as we go into August. Normally, attention turns to the Olympics. It's August. People are tired of this crap. The conventions were fairly early this year. So I think we'll get a little bit of a lull. And then what we can count on is kind of reshuffling of the decks as we get into the debates, where, again, they're on the stage in front of a national audience. And as we saw in the last 2 weeks, an audience, at least around the margins, that's willing to move, and move to the point where Trump was in the lead for a day or two in the middle of a Democratic convention. And then I think we'll settle down to being down somewhere in the 5% or so range. Currently, we're seeing numbers around 7%, but again, I think that'll compress. It's going to be a very tight race. The debates are going to, I think, be the next seminal expected event, but we can and know we will see the unknown in the interim here that will reshuffle the deck again. The thing I turn to with some regularity is Nate Silver does a kind of composite of polls with a probability of one or the other candidate winning. And currently he's got Clinton in the kind of 65% or so chance of winning stage. I think that's somewhat accurate. And yet I would expect it to compress. And I think she'll probably throughout this, unless something dramatic unknown changes the deck or the debates change the deck, I think she'll hold this slightly more likely than not to win status right through Election Day.
Thanks, Jeff. We've got just a couple minutes left, so I'm going to ask each of you just to weigh in quickly on a question. Ken noted that each of the candidates have high negatives, so I'm wondering if the picks that they had for VP will help them in the election.
Okay, well, I'll start. I would say, given who they chose, it's probably almost irrelevant. They both chose two boring, sort of no-name, invisible people. If Trump, for example, had picked Newt, which apparently he was in the final three, that actually could have been a game changer. Frankly, I think the reason he didn't pick him was he might have overshadowed Trump, which is hard to believe. I think about the only real game changer here, barring one of the natural disasters that Jeff ticked off, is the debates. And if I were in charge of the debates, I'd put them on pay-per-view. This could be the most watched television event in history, including Super Bowls, although there's already controversy, as you know, or you may know, because Trump has pointed out that debates have been put on dates when there are NFL games. And I didn't know Debbie Wasserman Schultz got to pick the debate dates. So I'm just kidding. So Trump's already saying he's not going to honor the debate dates. So we're already having a debate about the debates. But if there's one thing that people are going to be eager to see, it's the two of them going at each other. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
My sentiment on the vice presidential picks was I thought they were very safe, not the dominant characters of each. I thought Pence for Trump was smart, and that if you were trying to, because I think he's assuming too much of the support of his base that may not show up, and he'll need every one of them to win. And I think Pence was a clear kind of, while not establishment, party, Tea Party orientation, that part of the wing that was probably pretty empathetic to Ted Cruz, who he certainly needs to garner there. So I thought that was a safe pick. And I felt of Kane, it wasn't what many had, some on the far left had hoped, and some in the party had feared. It wasn't a lurch to the hard left to try to garner the Sanders supporters. It wasn't the Elizabeth Warrens or Secretary Perez or Sherrod Browns who would be viewed more favorably within the kind of far left of the party. Here's a guy who's been relatively supportive of trade deals and is, from a clearly purple state and a pretty centrist, moderate governor, though his voting record in the Senate has been more liberal than his practices as a governor and mayor in some of his other positions. And I think he's viewed as one who's able to work across the aisle. So it's probably an eye toward, similar to what Obama did, an eye toward an optimistic view of hers in the event that she does win. Is he a vice president who can serve a useful role in trying to negotiate with Congress, particularly the Senate? And I think he'll be good at that. And I think he does from a demographic standpoint. To me, Florida and Ohio are the 1 and 2 states that need to win the election. After that, if Democrats lose those two, it gets very hard for them to win. But the way they could still win is by winning Virginia, Nevada, and Colorado. And so I think Tim Kaine was the best pick from those 3 states demographically for a vice presidential pick. And I think that was part of the consideration. And they didn't need to give up the Senate seat in electing him because Terry McAuliffe, the governor of Virginia, will pick a Democratic replacement.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Jeff. So we are at time, and I want to thank both of our participants for offering their perspective today. This was a really lively discussion. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, MetLife, for their contribution today. So we will see everybody next month on our next advocacy webinar, and I really appreciate you tuning in today. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.